Welcome back to another episode of Full Proof Theology. I'm Chase Davis, I'm your host. Good to be with you here again today. I've got on the show today a friend who we've actually never met in person, but we've talked quite a bit down in Durango, Colorado. We're going to talk about Durango, where that is for you listeners who are not familiar with Colorado, but I got Tom Thiessen on the show. He's the pastor at Gospel Church Durango. Tom, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chase.
Hey, so we're going to get into your book. Just came out, Lord of the Feast. Great book, I think, for the audience on YouTube. You can see that there. I'll put a link to the show in the show notes to the book where people can pick it up. So we'll definitely get into that, talking about feasting, festivals, alcohol, communion, family worship, all sorts of things in that. But first, I just wanted to hear some of your story, not only for me, but for the listeners, kind of like when you got into ministry, when you became a Christian, when you became the pastor of Gospel Church. Just tell me some of that stuff.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And yeah, it's good. I was raised in a Christian home, came to faith super young. I was probably 3 years old, maybe 4. Yeah, I was just raised by godly parents and who modeled a lot of this stuff for me. And so that's where I learned it, which is cool. Yeah, I grew up in the church, was called to ministry at 19 years old. So I went to college here in Durango, Colorado. It's in Southwest Colorado in the Four Corners. So it's kind of Colorado-y and also kind of deserty and Southwesty, which is cool. So yeah, I went to college here, Fort Lewis College, got a degree in philosophy, and then started pursuing ministry, went to Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, studied there, had a great experience, and then came back to Colorado. And actually, it's funny, I got hired on to work at a church plant in Boulder. And the night I packed up my U-Haul with all my stuff and got canceled the lease, got my wife and my 2-week-old son, and we were ready to roll the next morning. And then the guy called me and was like, "Oh, the funding dropped out. And so we don't have the job for you anymore."
No way. When was this?
That was probably 2005, 2006.
Wow. What was it? A Southern Baptist church plant? What was it?
Yeah, I think it was a Southern Baptist church plant.
Huh.
So that was funny. So I almost ended up in Boulder, but I love what you're doing in Boulder. It's a great place to bring the gospel. But so we really quick came up with a new plan, moved in with some family for a couple months, and then the Lord brought us over to he opened a better opportunity. I interned at a CREC church in Grand Junction and served there for several years and learned a ton of stuff about ministry. Then after that, God called us to plant a church in Durango. So we came back. I had been in Durango for college. So came back, started the church. That was about 13 years ago. And we planted the church. It's just been slow, steady growth the whole time. When we got here, this guy, who was the church planting guru of the area, he said, what's your model? And I said, I don't really know. I'm not that good at church planting, but I'm going to teach the Bible and pray and, see what God does. He goes, the traditional model doesn't work anymore. But I said,
great.
If the word of God and prayer don't work, then we have no plan B. So that's it. And God's been faithful.
That is so good. I have so many questions just because of the proximity and the kind of story you're on with CREC, Southern. The Western Slope is a little bit different than the Front Range. It's a different culture. For listeners who don't know, the Front Range of Colorado is Denver, Colorado Springs, Fort Collins, Boulder, that kind of area. And then the Western Slope is Grand Junction, obviously on the west, bordering Utah, and then down into Durango, which is kind of like on an island separated by the San Juans and mountains down there. And a huge mountain biking culture down in Durango. But maybe just for listeners who go to my church or listeners on the Front Range who have never gone to the Western Slope, can you describe some of maybe the cultural particularities of the Western Slope for listeners?
Yeah. The Western Slope is a unique animal. I mean, it's in some ways it's a little bit more like the isolated, like people, they keep going west, trying to find a small town where they can get away from people. And so there's a bit more of that kind of isolation, like leave me alone. When we first moved into our neighborhood and planting the church, and we like invited all the neighbors over for a barbecue, just trying to get to know them and minister to them, and nobody came. And finally a guy, he looked out his window and saw me out there barbecuing by myself. And he came out and he's just like, man, like, thanks for trying, but like, we don't do this around here. It's like, you don't do what? He's like, we don't like hang out with each other, go to each other's houses. Like, we don't, nice try, but we don't do that. So there's that. And then there's just kind of like there's a cowboy, there's kind of the old, cowboy culture. And then there's the like, crunchy, new agey culture that like have come together in Durango, and that depends on which town you're in, but Durango's especially that way. And so it's kind of a funny dynamic there.
Yeah. And how many people live in Durango?
Oh, maybe 50,000, 60,000. So it's hard to gauge because there's so many little mountain communities around that all feed Durango, but aren't technically part of it.
Yeah, it's a good sized community. And I, from what I understand, it's experiencing a lot of the same problems like that ski towns and other places in Colorado experiencing with housing shortages because of being surrounded by mountains, building. Has that caused a lot of like economic turmoil down there or anything like that? Are you seeing people struggling?
No, Durango's pretty strong economically. It's just like we get all the Texans. They all want to come to the mountains and like New Mexico people and Texans, and they'll just like, there's the tourism just abounds and kind of keeps it afloat. And then there's, I think a lot of like wealthy people have second homes in Durango. And so they kind of come in like that kind of helps like bolster everything and keep it pretty healthy. It's kind of a bubble a little bit economically.
For sure. With the CRAC, you were part of a church plant in Grand Junction. What were some particularities you noticed going to Southern? That's a very different, Louisville, Kentucky is a very different culture than Durango. And then you go to Southern, which is its own ecosystem of kind of ministry models and that kind of thing. Then you go serve in a CRC church. What were some differences you noticed maybe in those two things, and how did that shape your approach to ministry today?
Yeah. I think the main difference that I noticed was the shape of the piety. And that's been really significant for me. There's the like, Southern was probably way more influenced by like the John Piper, real, like, I don't want to call it pietism, but it's real, it's real emotive and real sweet. I mean, when you talk to people at Southern, they use the word sweet a lot.
Okay.
Jonathan Edwards did too, but it's like, there's just kind of a sweetness to the culture that's beautiful and it's endearing. Whereas like both the Western Colorado mix and then the CREC culture that I interned in, which wasn't that new to me. I mean, I came up in a church that was joining CREC, and so it wasn't my first exposure to it. But singing the Psalms. I mean, I remember like looking around, we're singing the Psalm about, dashing heads on the rocks, and people are just kind of, and dash their heads up on the rocks. And I'm just, taken aback. But that piety, that's just more about faithfulness, like a multi-generational vision for things, not just kind of like, how do I feel towards God this morning when I read the scriptures, but like, what's my plan for my grandkids? That piety was just really like it was kind of jarring. And it took me a while really to kind of navigate that and figure out, what's biblical and how to put all that together.
Yeah. And it's so fascinating that you mentioned that church planting guru, because they exist all over the place. I mean, I think Ed Stetzer was kind of is the biggest name in that industry, if you want to call it an industry. But, when church planters move here to plant in Boulder, at this point, we're trying to tell them what you're saying, which is like, they're like, well, what should I do? And we're like, well, you should, preach the Bible and pray and, have worship, and they're like, yeah, but like, how do you reach people? And I'm like, you go meet people and you invite them. You try the barbecue thing. No one shows up. That's fine. But so much of the attractional church model, if we can call it a model, is so much based on marketing and that kind of thing. And, when we planted, we didn't have a marketing budget at all. I don't think that was because we didn't want one. It's because we had no money. And we could afford a balloon, an orange balloon, and our branding at the time was orange. And so we were like, we would invite people to church. They'd be like, where is it? And they're like, oh, it's in North Boulder, on this street. Look for the orange balloon. And every Sunday we'd hang an orange balloon. We couldn't afford a sign.
Just one balloon, the love balloon.
And then even before that, we couldn't afford a sign, and it was just my apartment. And so I printed out a piece of paper on my computer. It said, "This is the Well Church. Come on in." And that was it. So attractional model has never been our luxury. It's never.
Yep.
And then slowly over the last 4 years, as we've just become more convictional in certain matters, obviously we've been blessed with being here for 13 years. But we'll still put up signs. It's not wrong to do that. And we're looking to buy a sign for our building that's really nice. But I just think, for a lot of church planners, they have this idea of church planning where it's like, we got to put on the big show, or got to be, somehow the coolest thing in town. And it's like, man, you can do that, I guess. Let's look at the fruit, and let's look at what that's actually producing discipleship wise in families and people, rather than just kind of a motive experience. Have you seen that as well as a church planner?
Yeah. Durango is like a church planter's graveyard. I mean, people are constantly coming here. We really want to plant a church in Durango. We love Durango. It's super cool. I have a heart for Durango. And they often will find me on the internet. And so they'll call me and pick my brain about it. And I just always tell them, Durango doesn't need another failed church plant. We don't need another cool church. We don't need another church whose thing is they've got a good band. But we desperately need just faithful churches, just churches that just minister the word, straight over the plate and don't mess around. And if you want to come and give your life to Durango, we will support you. We'll be your best friends, but we just don't need any more. It comes to town. It's the big thing. It blows up. Everybody comes to it. People leave other churches, go to that, and then the guy burns out, or it's not the cool thing, or another one comes along, everybody goes to that one. The cycle continues, and it just doesn't make the kingdom better for Durango. It just doesn't advance, the mission. And so, we see it all the time. And just that slow, steady growth, I think, is generally what healthy growth looks like. You just got to plod, and you just got to power through for years and just keep going. And, the Lord just slowly builds it healthy.
For sure, man. Well, that's great. I want to make sure we get into your book, but we could probably talk about this stuff for hours, because both you and I have experience, and I could bring Matt on the show, and we could have a lot of fun conversations about things we've learned, lessons we've learned, mistakes we've made, opportunities we see. But I want to talk about your book, Lord of the Feast. Obviously, with a title like that, it's about feasting and festivals, and we'll talk about at the end of the show some unique things your church does. But I wanted to know kind of why you wrote the book. Why do you think this is important for Christians to think about? Why should Christians think about feasting more than they do right now?
Yeah. There's a bunch of different reasons I wrote it, and reasons for all that. But I think, and this starts to get into the festivals also, but one of the foundational ideas of the thing is just noticing that Christians do a bunch for Christmas, and we have all these traditions, and we cut down a tree and drag it into our house, and we string up lights all over the place, and we do all this stuff. And it's culturally normative. You go in the store and they're playing, songs about Jesus. And then Easter comes around, and it's just kind of I don't know, maybe we'll do a brunch and put on our pink shirt and, and it's just fun. It's striking. It's funny that we don't do that. And so a lot of the ideas kind of come out of that. And but then that, drives us back to the Bible, and what does the Bible say about feasting? And it's just, the Bible's filled with feasts and feasting and festival. And I think that, another major idea that sparked it in my mind was preaching through Exodus, and God tells Moses to tell Pharaoh, let my people go so that they may come and hold a feast to me. And then Moses restates it a little ways later, and he says, God said, let my people go that they may come out and serve me, like worship me. And that just like made some connection in my mind that feasting to the Lord, first, like, what does it mean to feast to the Lord? And why is that like so synonymous with worship? Because like, so feasting is an act of worship. And so that's, I think, like pretty close to the heart of why I think we should feast more. Like it honors God, and he wants us to be a festive people. He's the Lord of the feast. Like, this is who our God is. And maybe even some of that ties back into the question you asked about the, like how I tried to work out those different like approaches to piety, like to our love for God, is like the family worship, the feasting together, eating together around the table. The Lord's Supper ties into that, like all those things together. But in the Bible, like the feasting is joyful. I mean, the psalmist says, blessed is he who knows the festal shout. Like, what in the world is a festal shout? Like, who's doing that? And so, how do we do this? Like, David, I think it says, was dancing with all of his might before the Lord. Like, how do we learn how to do that stuff? That honors the Lord. That gives him glory. But I like read that kind of stuff in the Bible, or, Nehemiah saying, don't be sad, do not cry, because today is a holy day to the Lord. And you're kind of like I read that, and then I think we think like, okay, it's a holy day to the Lord. Like, let's furrow our brows and get real serious. And so just like, I read the Bible and then I see our experience, and I think we need to do better at like learning how to do this and just be a festive people, a people who feast, a people who know how to have festivals to the Lord and to honor him in and through all that.
Yeah, I think Christians, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. It seems to be that Christians get confused in typically one of two ways, or I guess the third way, not third way, like the rhetorical technique, which I hate. But third way is in like they'll think these things don't matter. They'll think that it's not important, and we kind of have a not an over spiritualized, but like we read the Old Testament and we think that was then. Now we're under the New Covenant, and we don't need to do any of that. I see some Christians, I've even seen local Southern Baptist churches they'll hold like special times for the Feast of Booths. This is when the Jews traditionally celebrated the Feast of Booths, so we're going to celebrate, or they'll do a Seder meal or something like that. And you can sense that they are searching for something more than a kind of almost monastic or almost how even Buddhist approach to the New Testament, where it's just kind of like there is no festival, no feasting. Those were two. I guess I don't have a third way, but those would be the two kind of errors I see. Do you sense those errors as well? What do you think Christians miss about festivals and feasting?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think part of what drives the like trying to go back under the law and go back to the old covenant feasts is like we live in such a rootless time. Like, we don't have traditions. We don't have, we don't have this rootedness that really, and I think this is another element of feasts and festivals. Like, they're a huge part of communicating tradition and enculturating it, like building rich and robust culture. These things do that. Like, if you think about like a people that has a rich culture, like, you tend to think about dances and festivals and, they dress up and they've got rich foods. And I mean, all that's the stuff of festival, which I think is just really at the heart of passing on tradition and knowing who you are as a people. And so I think people see, like, we have this rootlessness and this, globalized, homogenized, like just a bunch of individuals, like a random bag of marbles that were just all bouncing around. And we look back at the Jewish feasts and we're like, that will help us. Like, there's roots, right? And we talk about it in terms of the roots. And so I think that motivates that, but then it bypasses the reality of what Christ has done. Like, Christ has done some radical new thing. James Jordan talks about the stars in Genesis being for festival times. Like in Genesis 1, that's kind of the word that's used. And so Jesus has come, and like the stars have fallen, and Christ is now the sun. Like, we now live in the day. And so we don't follow that same festal calendar. Like, we don't follow those same things. And so to go back for the roots is the wrong way. And you have to trample over Christ's work to get back to the old covenant stuff to try to celebrate it. But I think the principles that we take from the old, we don't dismiss, we're not dispensationalists. We don't just throw away the Old Testament. So the principles we gather from that are just the significance of festivals, the significance of feasting. And so then that keeps us from avoiding the other error of just like, well, we just sit alone quietly in a room and that's our feast,
Right, yeah.
But it's not like it's real, and God gave us a sacrament with literal bread that he wants us to eat. He wants us to drink wine and eat bread in his honor. And so those things are not done away with. And so now we refigure. I think it's important that we relearn how to do those. We build our own culture. And I think the church doesn't do great with knowing how to build and pass on the things we love through culture, particularly through feasting and festivals around the heart of our faith, the death and resurrection of Jesus first, and out from there in different areas.
Yeah, and I sense this as a millennial guy, just like growing up in suburban America, and I would see other cultures. I can remember, like in high school, think about like the Irish culture and how there's traditional food, there's traditional beliefs, superstitions, certain preferences, or Greek culture. All these people, whether immigrants, whatever communities in America, they have certain, like, this is what we do, this is how we celebrate, this is who gathers. And growing up as kind of in a mega church in a suburban context, there was just not a lot of that. And I was always kind of like, why don't we have that? What would that be like if we had tradition, at least in Texas, where I'm from, obviously because of the flag. There was like some tradition passed on as far as like our legacy is dying at the Alamo or something like this. Like there's some tradition passed on there. In Colorado, it's kind of bleak in terms of people moving here from out of state. There's no tradition. There's not a lot of family. And so I think the church has a unique opportunity to kind of recapture the vision you set forth in your book. One question I would have for you, because you highlight Christmas and Easter, and I'm wondering how far you go in the church calendar. Are you like, Day of Ascension guy, Pentecost? Are you feasting on those days, or how do you see all of that playing out as far as kind of like the overlap with the church calendar? Because when I see the Book of Common Prayer and I see that tradition, I'm like, well, that would be an easy plug and play, not looking for the easiest path, but just saying like, this is Christian tradition. So do you go that far, or what does it look like at your church to do these kind of things?
Yeah. We don't do all of the church calendar. I think like our plan is just to start, like we want to start with Easter and build out from there. And so like we're emphasizing that, and then we're trying to, like, Christmas, I think we do a fairly good job of culturally. And so we're trying to like tap into that and then see how we can do that better. And then from there, I think we have certain intentions to build out from that. But that's basically like our bread and butter right now. And I know, like I've heard Doug Wilson say, if every day is a feast day, then no day is a feast day. Like I think there is a way to push it so far that it's always the feast of something. It's hard to even keep up with it. So I don't know. Like I'm learning some of those things, and I imagine we'll continue like stepping into more of those. But right now we're just like trying to build out from the big ones and make that a big deal. But
you do monthly. I mean, what I read in the book, I believe y'all do like monthly kind of feasts as a church. What is that like?
Yeah, it's nothing unusual. Like it's just like your Baptist potluck, man. Sure. And it's awesome. I mean, we love it, but we just call it a feast, and we encourage people to bring the best food, make tons of good food, and just celebrate and feast together, and just see that like as a culture building thing. So yeah, it's real normal. The monthly feast is but it's delightful. And we tell people, like, I know you see this all the time as a pastor. Like people go like, I don't feel connected at the church. Like I don't feel like I'm part of the community or whatever. And like, we'll just tell, like, are you coming to the monthly feast? Like that's that's just a really easy way. Like you just sit down and eat with somebody
Right.
and you just feel connected to them. Like it's
Right.
just, that's the design. That's how God built it.
For
And
sure.
so I really think we're just trying to like recover. Like that's a long tradition. Tons of churches do that. We're just trying to recover that and like do it really well.
Yeah. My wife grew up in a Baptist church. And so they, in the church, they had a kitchen, and she still has fond memories of the old ladies who would bring in their, casserole dish and put it in the buffet line. And they would, this is a traditional Baptist, kind of like Southern Baptist potluck. So I love that attitude. One of the things that I think gets missed oftentimes is the purpose of the Lord's Supper and communion as a type of feast. I know for us, when we kind of like, what we used to do is we used to do intinction, which is dipping the bread in the wine. I think we just did that because it was like, one, seemed easier, and two, seemed innovative because a lot of churches were doing it. And we're like, okay, but then we would have Presbyterians come to our church and be like, why do you do intinction? And I was like, I don't know what intinction is. And so I would go look up the word, and I was like, I don't know why we do intinction. It's just what we do. And then over the last 4 years, as we've kind of like matured a little bit on these matters, we've put a bigger emphasis on corporate communion together as a church family, because what it used to be is people would go to the table kind of on their own as a response in worship, and it would be like this private time. We would guard the table in the sense we tell you, if you're not a Christian, don't participate. But besides that, it's just kind of a free for all. And when we moved to more of a corporate, we're going to take it together, we had some people that were like very concerned, like, well, what about my private time? What about this? And then we even had people that were like, I'm confused. I thought I'm supposed to feel bad during communion, and
Right.
you're telling me we should celebrate. So, basically I'm asking you to speak into that for me as another pastor. What is the purpose, or like, what is the perspective you're offering that you believe to be biblical, obviously, that may be unique or may challenge some conceptions of the Lord's Supper that are common out there?
Yeah, that's a bunch of good stuff. I mean, the corporate nature of it is huge. Like Paul says, because we partake of the one loaf, we are one body, which I think is really cool. It always kind of takes me off guard that he doesn't say, because we're one body, we all partake of the one loaf. But like, there's something profound. Because we partake of the one loaf, we are one body. It's kind of the point of communion is our unity, like our unity with Christ, and then also our unity together. And so I think that's crucial. And I think, again, like that gets back to the same like idea about different approaches to piety, right? That I talked about earlier. I mean, is it like me getting alone with Jesus and like trying to get in the feels, or is this like us like feasting together before the Lord? And then I think that gets into the vibe of it too. Are we, am I just supposed to like sit here and think like, I'm so sorry that my sins made Jesus die? Or are we supposed to like rejoice before the Lord in this and see it as a feast? And I mean, one thing that we notice is we do weekly communion as soon as I came to the conviction that we're feasting with Christ. Paul says the bread which we break is fellowship with the body of Christ, and the cup we bless is fellowship with the blood of Christ. I was like, if we're meeting Jesus here, like I'm going to do that as often as I can.
Yeah.
And that's not going to get old, but then when we more recently switched to doing wine for communion, because you're convinced that's what Jesus did, and you're just best off doing what Jesus did. Like people just, wine, as it turns out, gladdens the heart of man. And so people like our communion on its own, like as soon as we introduced wine, it shifted to a more celebratory mode, and people were concerned about it. And they're like, man, things are getting a little too celebratory around here. Like we got to shut this down.
Right.
But it's like, no, I mean, this is a feast. And so we do a big loaf of bread, and we have actual glasses of wine that we pour, a substantive cup of wine into. And then we tell people, like, take a big chunk of bread, take a glass of wine, go back to your seat, and then we'll all eat and drink together. And it's because we want it to feel like a feast.
Yeah.
And it does, and it's awesome.
That's great. When you pour a big glass of wine, are you telling them to just shoot it all at once? Or how do you keep going in the worship services where everybody's just feasting at that point? I'm genuinely curious because like that sounds like, well, we're going to be here for a couple minutes as people, enjoy their bread and wine. So what is that like?
Yeah. Yeah. And part of that is like a household. So the dad, or he'll bring a couple kids or whoever, but somebody will come up and get the bread and the wine. So usually it's like a glass of wine for the household. And so they'll kind of share it, or, maybe a couple glasses for the household, depending on how big the household is. So it's not a ton,
Okay.
For each person. But I mean, it's fine. And we're just like, we're lingering at the table. Like we don't rush through communion. Like we're sitting with Christ, we're fellowshipping with the body and the blood of Christ. So just sip that wine for a minute. We're just there. We're enjoying the fellowship, and the fellowship with Christ. And then, it's right towards the end. So we do that. And then we stand up and we tell everybody, lift up your hands. We sing the doxology. And it's just exultant, and it's, one of the best parts. And the kids are all, doing it first. Their hands are up, and they're, starting to sing before the rest of us. And so it's just like we linger at the table, we eat our bread, we drink our wine, then we stand up and lift our hands and we sing. And then, I just speak the blessing over God's people, and we're done. And so then it just transitions really nicely into like fellowship time. Then everybody's just hanging out and just fellowshipping with one another, and people just stay forever. And they always kind of did, but I think the communion helps that. And even the wine, I think, has facilitated that. And people just linger and hang out forever.
That's great. And then one more question, and then I want to talk about particularly the wine and alcohol, because this is something that is concerning for certain individuals. When you're taking communion, is it? I'm just curious about, because there's been huge debates, huge fights in church history over what is it? What is it doing? And the traditional kind of Baptist view is memorial. It's just a time of remembrance. Is that one that you would hold, or do you also emphasize other aspects you talked about unity already. So what other aspects? How are you educating and equipping people to think more biblically about the Lord's Supper?
Yeah, we don't hold to the bare memorial view. We believe in the spiritual presence of Christ in communion. I love the way I was catechized on the Westminster Catechism and grew up on Westminster Confession, and so the language there is just like, as really and truly as we swallow the bread into our mouths and the wine goes into our stomachs, as truly as that, yet not corporally but spiritually, do we commune with Christ and feed on Christ at the table. And so we kind of use that language. And then I just probably most weeks I just allude to Paul's words, where I'll just say, we fellowship with Christ here. As Paul said, the bread which we break, is it not fellowship with the body of Christ? And the cup which we bless is not fellowship with the blood of Christ. And so just constantly, like, that's, I think, the strongest biblical support for the case that we're meeting with Jesus truly there. And so I just say it all the time. And I think that just, it just feels normal to people, I think.
For sure. The issue with alcohol, if people don't know, if you're a listener and don't know, this is a big issue, particularly in Southern Baptist circles, Baptist circles generally, because there is going back 100 years, there's kind of this view of alcohol that's incredibly negative. It's bad for society. It's bad for you. It's not biblical, all this kind of stuff. And, I have friends that are teetotalers, and I'm not trying to throw any shade at them for that. Respect that position for what it is, but it does become a bit of a problem when it's like enforced. And so I want to talk about why wine? Do you offer juice? I know we're getting into, for the listener, I know we're getting into particularities, but these are real questions that people have, and they need to think about as Christians. And so let's start with, why wine, not juice? And let's then go into weaker brother, kind of, I think, stronger brother, and some ways we can think about that particular issue in that frame of mind. So first, why wine and not juice?
Yeah. So I do a whole chapter in the book trying to lay this out really carefully, because it's kind of a minefield. But But I think it's like the Bible is just like the perfect guide. I mean, it just walks you right through the minefield and just tells you exactly where to step. And it's glorious. But wine, we just, like, Jesus used wine at communion. Like, that's what they were doing at Passover. That's what he was using. In Corinth, they were getting drunk off of it. And so if it wasn't wine, like, there was some kind of, miracle going on.
Right. Yeah.
Like, this is what the church was doing. It's what Jesus instituted. And it's funny to me that it never occurred to Paul, like, while the church in Corinth was getting drunk at communion, like, that's crazy. And while they're doing that, like, it never occurred to Paul to be like, we got to get rid of wine. Like, we made a mistake, or you guys just need grape juice. Hey, Corinth, once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. You'll never be able to get over this. Like, it's just, that's not what he does. He just never says that. Because God likes to give dangerous gifts to his kids. Like, when your sons get a certain age, like, you give them a pocket knife because, like, they need to, they're probably going to cut themselves, and they usually do, but it's like, they need to learn. That's how you mature. And God's like that. I mean, he gives us sex and people just destroy their lives with it. But he's just like, here, take this, like, these raging desires for this thing, and, like, keep them in the bounds of marriage, and it's like, here's wine, like, and people ruin their lives with it, but just, like, don't get drunk. And this is, like, we mature through this process. And when we just avoid it, I think we lack, we lose that opportunity to mature and to learn how to do stuff well.
Yeah. When you have somebody that, is walking in sobriety that doesn't want to participate in wine, how do y'all just say, no, you have to, you're going to drink wine? Or, like, what do you, because, like, one time, this was back in the day, and we did it different than Intinction this Sunday. We did elders serve the elements, and we had wine. We also had juice. And one new person to the church came and took the elements, and then she came up after the service and, like, I'm an alcoholic and I'm walking in sobriety, and you served me wine and I didn't know it was wine, and you've broken everything I've worked for. And I was like, oh no, I felt horrified. And so I'm just wondering how that would be an extreme example, but you've also got people that just don't drink for whatever reason. How do you accommodate that, or what do you do at your church for that?
Yeah. And let me say one other thing that I like on why to use wine. I mean, the Bible is so filled with, like, wine is a blessing, and wine is for feasting, and wine makes your heart glad. And when God's blessing a people, he tells them, like, your vineyards are going to abound and you're going to have all the wine. And when he's cursing them, he's like, I'm taking away the vineyards and I'm taking away the wine. Like, this is part of the joy and the glory. And we want that. Like, we don't want to say, no, Lord, we're too serious and a little too holy for that. But for people who struggle, so we have a row of cups with grape juice in them. And we tell people, if you have an issue of conscience with wine, we're happy to accommodate your conscience, and just let us know when you come to the table, and we'll give you a glass of grape juice. If it's just like a preference, like, you have this whole spectrum of people, and some of them are like, I just don't like the taste of alcohol. And we say, like, well, we're going to drink it with Christ in the new heavens and the new earth. And so, like, now's a great time to develop a taste for it. Or even if it's but the weaker brother, you talked about the weaker brother, like, that's where it's a conscience issue. Like, the way that you stumble your weaker brother is by, like, coercing him or pressuring him into doing something that he thinks is a sin.
Right.
And that's the weaker brother problem. Like, the weaker brother problem usually gets spun as though it's like, a guy just doesn't want you to drink, or, like, he doesn't like it. And so then he just says, well, I'm the weaker brother and you can't do it. But that's not the stumbling of the brother that Paul talks about. The stumbling of the brother is emboldening him to sin against his conscience. And so that's why, like, we accommodate people's conscience with grape juice, and then we seek to inform their conscience over time. I mean, Paul also says, don't let what is your good be spoken of as evil.
Right.
So we don't let them control the narrative. Like, a weaker brother shouldn't control the narrative of what's good. The stronger brother should control the idea in the congregation of what's good. We're actually commanded not to let what's good be spoken of as evil. And wine is good. It's a blessing from God. And so we just make sure that we're talking about it that way, that we're presenting it that way, but then we accommodate the weaker brother and not to quarrel over it. And we don't, it's just, we talk about the judging and despising all the time. Like those are the two commands that Paul gives for the weaker and the stronger brother. The weaker brother can't judge the stronger brother, and the stronger brother can't despise the weaker brother. And you just watch those temptations arise in those relationships. And it's like the weaker brother's like, you're wrong for doing this. They're judging. We're like, you're not allowed to say that. Like, you're not allowed to say this is wrong and judge the rest of the congregation or put your scruples on everybody when, like, God's word judges us. But then the stronger brothers can't be like those, teetotalers, like they don't have to, just despise them. Like, why don't they drink the wine? Like, and so we just all welcome one another and we accommodate their conscience in that way. And it's worked great. I mean, there was a fair amount of hand-wringing from certain circles when we were switching to wine, but I just taught on this for 2 years before we changed. Like, gotcha. I just taught and I explained it. Then I did whole sermons on it. And then I said, if anybody wants to know about this, like, let's just talk about it. If you have questions, if you have concerns. And we spent, a year, 2 years, just like hearing people out, pastoring them through it before we ever did anything.
That's great.
So that we didn't trample on anybody.
Yeah, that's wise. You seem like a really good pastor because our elders wrestled with it, and then we announced it, and we said, we're switching to wine next week. See you next Sunday. and I hope we said, I can't remember if we said, if you have any questions, I'm sure we did. If you have any questions, please come talk with us. We'd be happy to chat with you. But we didn't do a lot of it. I think we just assumed it. Being in Colorado, there's a lot of beer, there's a lot of this stuff. So we assume the norm. We've always been a church that, if we're going to have a gathering, that stuff is going to be permissible. And so we've wrestled with this, but yeah, it sounds like you did a really good job of incorporating it into the body. One analogy you use in the book that I thought was really interesting is kind of like veganism. Because I'm in Boulder, and I'm assuming in Durango you get the same thing. You get a lot of vegans. And so, but a vegan typically will not make their scruple about eating meat binding on everyone else. I mean, you'll get some ones that think you should for secular reasons, but also just because they're that type of person. And so how does that analogy play out in terms of weaker brother, stronger brother type arguments?
Yeah, I just think it helps us to see it more clearly. Like, the alcohol thing is so emotionally wrought, especially with like those who have a long Baptist tradition in it, or those who've had, like family members who've struggled with it. And it's just like, it's a deep emotional issue. And so to just be able to like, okay, let's reason by analogy over here. Like, what do we do if we have somebody who thinks eating meat is wrong? Like, it's cruel to animals, or like, the cows are farting and causing global warming. And so we need to stop, like, not be complicit in that. Like, I've never met anybody whose take was, we just can't have any meat at our, potluck or whatever, our fellowship meal, because we don't want to stumble our weaker brother. Like, I've never seen anybody reasoning that way. And yet, like, so many, that seems to be almost the default, at least in Baptist circles, way of reasoning about alcohol. Like, you don't know if somebody out there might have struggled with alcohol, and therefore you should never use alcohol publicly because you just don't know. I think, Jesus turned water into wine at a wedding. He didn't go around asking everybody, like, have you ever struggled with alcohol? Have you ever just, you assume the norm, like you said. And so I think it just helps us if we reason in that way, and we can look at it and think, yeah, like, I'm not going to try to coerce my vegan brother into eating meat. I'm not going to just, come on, do it. And, but neither am I going to impose his scruple on like the entire congregation. That would be crazy.
Yeah, I think it's crazy. But I do see Christians get stuck in this, because once you kind of embrace the weaker brother mindset as kind of the guiding principle for how we do life together, I think it honestly flows out of a lot of our reticence to speak plainly on cultural matters. But you see this in the minds of Christians all the time, like where, they'll have a community group and a vegan joins, and it's like, well, now we can't eat meat. And it's like, wait, what? Like, that's not how that works. And so I think it speaks to something much deeper about how we do life together as Christians, and how we honor God and just live our lives together in unity, because so many Christians have this weird view of not offending somebody or alienating anyone on these matters. And it's like, man, like, it's not a very fun way to live. and two, that's not what Paul's talking about there. So I just thought that was a really interesting analogy. I want to get to Resurrection Fest. You talk about this in the book, how your church does from Good Friday to Easter. So why don't you walk through what happens when you started it, and then what happens on that weekend? I mean, obviously, we're recording this the weekend after Easter, so I assume it's fresh for you. But what is Resurrection Fest in Durango? What does that look like?
Yeah, we started it. This was our fourth year in a row. We started in 2021. And just, for some of the reasons we've talked about wanting to make Easter a big deal. It's been successful. Like, our kids now say that Easter is their favorite time of year, like more than Christmas. They'll say it, like, we love Easter better than Christmas. It's like, that's what we're going for, right? We want this to be the biggest thing because the death and resurrection of Christ is the biggest thing. We started it. We've done 4 of them now. They're just awesome. I mean, it's not just the kids, like, we all love it. It has done so much good for our church. And I think it just objectively honors the Lord. And again, like, that's the point of all this, is that it, like, feasting to the Lord honors him. Like, if you want to make a big deal of somebody, you hold a feast to them. We do it all the time. On somebody's birthday, what do? Like, how do we honor them? Like, we bake them a special thing of, cake, and then we light it on fire, and we sing the ritual song, and we do all the liturgical operations, and in order to, and we present them gifts, and we do all this stuff to honor them, to show them objectively, and not just honor them like in some hidden secret place of our heart. And so that's what we're trying to do to the Lord. And I think that's we just want to iterate that over and over again, that the Resurrection Fest is first and foremost a worship festival. Like, it's an act of worship to God. We're bringing honor to the Lord. We're saying, look, you did this glorious thing in the death and resurrection of Christ. How do we even begin to respond to that appropriately? And so we just wear ourselves out in celebration, and we still feel like we're not scratching the surface, but it just feels really fitting to try. So we start the thing, because it's all about worship. We bookend it with worship. We start and end. We start with Good Friday worship on Friday evening. We end with Lord's Day worship on Sunday morning. So we start with a Good Friday worship. Sometimes we've done that with other churches that we're like-minded with, and we get together. When that works, we do that. We take communion at that, and we just do, a shorter service, an hour long, but we worship together. We kick the thing off with that. This guy, Joseph Pieper, who's done a lot of good work on festivals, he says that worship is the heart of festival. He says no festival can continue without worship. Like, that's the beating heart that drives all festival. And you see it even with, Burning Man. They're doing some weird, whatever it is they're doing when they burn that man. It's a pagan kind of worship thing. That drives worship, always drives festival. Without it, it dries up. So we start with that Good Friday worship, and then we have teams of people. We have bands of musicians that go downtown onto Main Street and just go on street corners and sing songs about the resurrection. Usually just classic hymns about Christ's death and his resurrection. And it's awesome. We want to fill every street corner, and year to year we have different numbers of musicians and stuff. But it's cool. I mean, we're just proclaiming the gospel from the street corners. And as long as you do it with a melody to it, people love it. They stop and thank you for it. People are trying to give us money, we're like, it's fine. Just come to our festival.
I think you're
we have evangelists with each group. Yeah. But people stop and they sing along and they cry, and they're moved by it, and they're just hearing the gospel proclaimed. And it's a beautiful thing. So we do that. And then we just encourage the people of the church, just go downtown and just make it festive. Just walk around, listen to the music, and just, look for opportunities to talk to people. So that's Friday. And then Saturday, we come back in the morning. We start setting up, because we block off the whole street. So we have a block party. So you get people just setting up for all that. And then we do this worship procession is the first thing we do. So we just gather a group of people, and we go down Main Street, and we just proceed in worship right down the middle of the street. And we sing a couple resurrection songs, and the kids have tambourines, and we've got, so there's a psalm that says the musicians, it talks about a procession of worship into the house of the Lord. And I think it says the singers are in the front, the musicians are in the back, and in the middle are the virgins with tambourines, I think is what it says. And so we kind of like are trying to model after that biblical example. So we just got music and songs, and we've got these standards that people are holding, and they just have, this says Christ is risen, death is dead. And we're just worshiping down the street, and people are coming out of their stores and watching and videoing and smiling and waving. And it's, it honors God. It gives him objective glory. It also, I think, just like demonstrates the lordship of Christ over the heart of our town. Like the cultural center of our town, and even some of the surrounding areas, is like our downtown. And so we're putting worship right into the middle of that, and declaring the lordship of Christ. And it's really a powerful thing. I think it says stuff to the principalities and powers. It says stuff to our town. It tells people like, this place belongs to Jesus. This is his. And it's wonderful. And we do it in a way, like, it's hard to frown at a parade, And so people, like, one year there was a guy, and he's like giving us the thumbs down as we're going by. My wife looked at, she plays the accordion in the procession, and she looks over and sees him. And then when he like makes eye contact, then he just kind of like,
sure.
And so it's awesome. So we proceed in worship down the street, and then we end up at a park, and we bring lunches. And so we eat there and play kickball and have kind of a big thing, and it's public. Then we go back to the church. We have a block party where we've blocked off the whole street, and just like a carnival. I mean, there's just fun stuff to do, and bounce houses and, cotton candy and all that. And then we're setting up for a feast. We do this huge feast where we just invite everybody for free. We're smoking briskets out on the street. And we just invite anybody who wants, can sign up for free and come. So we had like 180 people this year, lots of them from the community. Like, people just come, and we just set up on the street, and we feast. And then from there we go and have a concert and a dance. Like the Bible says to dance before the Lord. And we think, like, how do we do this? How do we do this and not be weird? And so we just like have a dance, and we just dance before the Lord, and it's awesome. And the Lord sent us this guy who knows how to do, like, organize people into group dances. And so you go down the line together with your spouse, and then you go back around outside, and everybody's clapping in time. And it makes it so it's not just this like isolated, individualistic, like, try to stand out there and look cool, but We're just like all doing this dance together, and that builds culture, Yeah. And it's just wonderful. So we dance till late, and then we're all exhausted, and we set the chairs back up, and we go home. Then we come back Sunday morning, have a brunch, and then conclude with worship. And we just have, worn ourselves out celebrating before the Lord.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, I saw the video. I don't know how I came upon it, but maybe one of your first ones or second ones, Resurrection Fest. And I just saw the video of y'all parading down Main Street in Durango with the holding the signs and stuff. And I was like, what is this? I love it. Like, this is amazing. And so, yeah, it's really a cool deal. I don't think I'll ever get to make it down being a pastor. I don't know if I'll ever, but maybe we could do something similar here. And that'd be pretty fun. So that sounds like a great deal. And I'm sure after Easter weekend, it sounds like, I would be pretty exhausted. So I appreciate you coming on the pod after all that. Want to make sure I plug for listeners where they can, we've talked about a lot of the book on here. Where can people pick up the book? What's a good website for that?
Yeah. So you can get them from gospelpresspublishing.com. And that's the publisher's site. And it's like, bear with it. It's pretty slow right now. We're working on a better website that can handle more traffic. So if it's a little bit slow, bear with it. But you can buy it direct there from the publisher, or then you can just buy it on Amazon. Those are the two best places to get it.
That's great. Anywhere else? I'll put a link to gospelchurchdurango.com. Anywhere else people should keep up with you to see what you're writing about, what you're preaching and teaching?
Yeah, the church website, Gospel Press Publishing is, we're trying to do lots of books and do lots of different stuff. We're working with some different authors right now. So that's a good place to keep up. And then, Twitter, I don't do blog usually, or I don't have a podcast, but I just try to do stuff, regularly on Twitter. So you follow me there. It's at Tom Thiessen. The S's are 5s. Resurrection Fest Durango, the festival has a website, Resurrection Fest Durango, and you can just kind of check that out and see a bunch of the details on there.
That's great. Well, Tom, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. It was fun.
Hey, if you're a listener and enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you share it with a friend. It's a great source of material. Go buy the book, share this episode with a friend, spark some good conversations on these matters. And if you like the show, enjoy the show, give it a great rating, subscribe on Patreon. That really helps me bring great content to you. And you can also give me show prompts. You can have discussions. We can talk about the book, anything like that on Patreon. At $5 a month, you get a sticker. And at $15, you get a mug. So go sign up there. You get early access to every episode I produce. And we will see you next time.